All right, I am Kurt from Microsoft, and today I'm talking about style sharing and Shadow DOM and a few proposals I've been working on. But before I dive in, I want to talk a little bit about the big picture, and that is exactly what I just heard here, which is web components have all these nice things for reusable components, but style sharing is a bit lacking. And so we have custom elements, we have Shadow DOM, and we have HTML templates. But the state right now is sharing styles is very hard, in particular with declarative Shadow DOM. So if you're using these frameworks instead of web components, you have all these cool options. And one of those is this thing called CSS and JS. And I wasn't really familiar with this until recently, but like there's a Wikipedia on it. And there's, I just show this as a, hey, you can do all kinds of stuff if you use a framework. If you use web components, you can't really do stuff like this. And so this is kind of interesting. In React, you can just import this thing, have one little string, and then you have this reusable component with your own tag that's isolated styles from the rest of the documents. So this is kind of, it's kind of strange. It's kind of amazing too, though. And if you were to do this with web components, it would be much bigger than that. And so, there's all these really cool options, like I said. There's things you can't do with Shadow DOM and some of these other frameworks. And they're typically not using Shadow DOM. They'll dynamically generate class IDs to make this work. And that lets you opt in and out of global styling. The other thing that these frameworks let you do is you can kind of control where the styles get inserted. Like if you want them all inlined, you want to prevent a flash of unstyled content, these frameworks can do that. So this is kind of what web components is up against as far as style sharing. And so do we want something like this natively? Probably not. I think this is like a very big crossing of different things, but is there more we can do for web components to share styles between elements? Like I absolutely think there are. So I'm going to talk about a few of those today. And it's not just me saying, hey, this is a problem. It's developers saying this is a problem. So the open styleable GitHub thread has there's this massive thread of people in the web components community saying, hey, this is a problem. Please solve this, somebody. And so I have some pretty telling quotes there. I won't read them all, but I think this is like pretty compelling that this is a problem that developers want to solve in web components. And so before I keep going, I think I'll do just like a really quick overview of Shadow DOM and why this is a bit of a challenge, because it won't make a ton of sense if this isn't clear. So just very simply, like Shadow DOM gives you style isolation. I have this simple p tag with a color blue. This is a declarative Shadow DOM there if you have a template with a shadow root mode. And so that's not getting this global p style, whereas the one outside of the Shadow DOM is. And then, if I were to switch that and move the style into the Shadow DOM, same thing, except it doesn't leak out of the shadow root. So pretty straightforward. The thing to keep in mind here is that this is extremely strict. There's not any way to say, hey, loosen this. And there's other reasons why you might want Shadow DOM, which is, it gives you ID isolation and all kinds of other things. So you're kind of, if you're doing reusable components, you kind of want Shadow DOM, but you might not want this strict of style isolation. And then Shadow DOM has two versions. There's scripts and imperative, which is script based. And then there's declarative, which I just showed you. Pretty straightforward. The reason why I bring this up is the imperative version has this adopted style sheets API. And this lets you have a shared style sheet that you can share with your shadow roots, which is pretty cool. There is no equivalent for the declarative version. And this is kind of a big deal because the declarative version can be very, very fast if you're doing server-side rendering. But then you hit this shared style issue. So what can you do with declarative Shadow DOM today? You basically have these three options. What I'm calling manual styling, which is essentially copy-paste style tags, which is not great. If you want to change one, you have to change a bunch. It also bloats your CSS payload, so this is not great. The least bad option is the external style sheet. You put your shared styles in a .css file and use a bunch of link rels. This is not terrible, but the downside is it's very easy to get a flash of unstyled content. This will, if you see a flash of unstyled content, it's probably due to link rel tags loading stuff asynchronously. So that's not great. You can throw the styles into a data URI and do that. That will avoid the flash of unstyled content because it'll get parsed synchronously in thrown in there. But this is also even worse for developer ergonomics. This is absolutely terrible. It's it's going to be an escaped string, and you have this problem with bloats and duplication. So, the least bad is the external style sheet, but it also introduces other problems. And I have this quote from MDN, which is kind of telling of like, this situation is not great without directly saying it, but saying, hey, use a style tag if you don't want to do all these things. So it's basically saying, if you want to do something, you're probably going to need the link tag.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I've used external style sheets without Shadow DOM, and I don't get the flash of unstyled content. Is there something about Shadow DOM that makes the flash of unstyled content more likely in that case?
Good question. Like I have a repro page where like, a lot of times you'll be like cloning nodes or duplicating them. And that will, I have a demo, like a bug that just gives you the flash of unstyled content every single time when you clone the style tag. Okay. So there might be things we can do to mitigate this, but
I know we have some heuristics that are like trying to avoid flash of unstyled content even with external style sheets. I don't know exactly how.
With external style sheets, you block rendering when the links are in the head.
Oh, in the head.
With the components, and you add them in the body.
Yes.
Links, they don't block rendering.
Okay, that is a good answer. Yes. So yes, if it's in the head, it will. So yes, great answer. Okay, so my first proposal I proposed at BlinkOn last October is this declarative CSS modules. So I'll talk about this just for a little bit. I have a whole video if you want to look. If you search for this at BlinkOn, you'll find my talk I gave then. But this was my original proposal I had for this, which is you have this script tag that contains styles. It could also be a style tag. But essentially you give it the CSS module type and a specifier. And then with this, you can really cleanly plug into that missing adopted style sheets API declaratively. And so I think this is pretty cool. It's kind of radically different than a lot of stuff in HTML today. But this does kind of solve this problem. So, I was going full speed ahead on this last October. And so I have an Edge explainer. I prototyped this locally in Chromium. And I started bringing it to the working groups. And so the tag actually gave some concern that said, at sheet seems like a better solution. And I was familiar with that sheet, but I hadn't really considered it for this case until the tag feedback came back. So I dug into this. And so I think this, does give us some cool options here. It's not quite the same, but I wanted to talk about this for a little bit just to share, what this is and how this helps for the situation. So, this is the first proposal, which is CSS at sheet. And so it's pretty straightforward. It's a new at rule. You can declare a sheet within a sheet and you get this kind of sheetception. So you can have like, sheet one with an identifier. And the most interesting part, I think, is that these styles don't apply right away. They have to get imported later on. And so that makes it really, really powerful and very clean for defining some styles that you can just immediately use later. And so this was actually proposed by Westbrook from Web Components back in 2020. And the original goal was for bundling. This is something that a lot of frameworks will do. And the goal there is to kind of have fewer network requests. So that was the proposal and the initial goal. And then in 2023, someone brought it to the CSS working group and they accepted it, but it kind of just stopped there. So with this from Tag, I said, hey, why don't I just revive this and get it moving? So yeah, that's all. I'll share all the updates today. I have a new explainer for this, in particular with the context of Shadow DOM. And then I was at the CSS working group last week. They had a face-to-face in New York, and so I had a bunch of proposals, a bunch of issues there that I got resolved, and I'll keep resolving more as I go. But this is now moving through the CSS working group. And then I have another proposal I'll talk about at the end of this. I'm calling LRLR. So I'll get to that in a few minutes, but the original goal was fewer network requests. This was like why Westbrook recommended it, is for bundling to have this natively for CSS. And interestingly, as a side effect of this, if you have a dictionary-based compression algorithm, when there's repeated blocks of text, those will increase your compression ratio. So I was kind of curious how good this would be in practice. So I found CNN had 2 heavy style sheets. I combine them into one file with @sheet syntax, threw them on a web server with just basic, I think it was gzip compression, and it got a 0.4% improvement. So it's not nothing, it's not huge, but it's it does have some impact. And then the other, initial goal is better style organization. I think, CSS can get very, very big and unwieldy. I think Sheet does give you some nice strategies for organizing. So I think that alone is also like a good reason to do this. But I think all three are kind of bonuses. And then the initial goal wasn't for Shadow DOM, but it does kind of help, and I'll show why. But yeah, the biggest reason is it lets you define styles without immediately applying them. And so, like I said, the CSS working group has already accepted this. So it's not, unlike CSS modules, this isn't kind of a more radical proposal. This kind of makes sense in CSS. And so, this was Westbrook's original proposal. He was mostly focused on JavaScript, where you can say, hey, let me import these two named sheets, and it would leave out that bottom one with the color orange. So it's pretty cool. We extended this a little more. Initially my thoughts were, hey, why don't we use a fragment identifier, and we could put this in a link tag or potentially a CSS import. So this seemed pretty reasonable. The only downside is that, well, there's two downsides to this. One is you can only have one fragment, and maybe we might want to allow importing multiple sheets in one link tag or one import, which wouldn't work with the fragments. The other bigger issue was I really want this to work with local styles that aren't. Yes.
You can have only one fragment. That fragment can have whatever syntax you want. So you could reinterpret that with, like, for instance, if you wanted to put a comma.
Comma, that's true. That's true. The other bigger issue though is the that it needs a file here. And so I brought that to the CSS working group to say, hey, could this work without a file for like an inline style tag? And their answer was no, because the fragments, the elements that's referenced in the fragment must be the same type as the overall documents. So like an A tag, an anchor fragment is going to be an HTML ID, whereas this is a CSS ID. So they said like this is not a good idea, but it's pretty straightforward to work around. If we add this new attribute, this kind of solves both problems. So if we have a sheet attributes, we can say potentially multiple sheets there. If we add this from keyword to add import, we could have potentially a comma separated list here. So I think this is a pretty good, pretty clean spot for this. And the fragment one, there's still people that are interested in that, but I think this is actually a little nicer and more flexible. So where is this at? I actually drafted a spec. It's not checked in yet. It's by a draft, I mean like literally a draft. It's hosted on my GitHub in this link, and then I have a pull request for CSS working group to eventually make this an actual W3C draft. And then I did, like I said, I discussed this at the face-to-face last week, resolved a bunch of issues, and there's a bunch of other ones already resolved. So I feel like this is, not too controversial. So I think I'm planning on doing an intent to prototype in Chromium soon. So I think this is, in good shape to start working on. And so, yeah, now is a good time for feedback on this. I think it's it's still at the time where if anyone has any ideas or objections or anything, like feel free to reach out to me directly, or in the GitHub threads too is totally fine too. So what about inline styles? Like this is completely focused on external CSS files. How could this work with inline styles? And so I've thought about this a lot, and I have another proposal, that might help. But why do we care about inline styles? Like the fetch operation has some CPU cost. The other thing is the flash of unstyled content, and now I understand why, which glad you're here to explain that. And so like, the other thing is sites that are really, really prioritizing the lowest FCP, things like Google search and other things. A common practice is to inline styles instead of using a link tag, just so it's all ready to go, when you're doing your first render. So, I think there are people that really do want inline styles here as, support for this. And so I have a proposal. I'm calling it LRLR, which is a little bit of a tongue twister. It stands for link rel local reference, or you can call it local reference link rel. I constantly mix it with my head. If anyone has a better idea for a name for this, I'm all ears. But what is it? So essentially it lets you reference a style tag's ID from a link tag. And so why would you want this? Well, you probably wouldn't want this outside of Shadow DOM, because it's just going to duplicate the styles you already have, right? But if we have, like I said, in declarative Shadow DOM, this is actually very cool. You could do this and say, hey, give me the style tag, and now it's blue. And then the style, this kind of gives you some of that cool stuff that these frameworks I was showing earlier that React has. it gives you some of that ability to share styles selectively with the main documents. And then, if you combine these two, you get this really clean, way where you can have styles defined early on and opt into them later selectively. And so I think it's, this to me seems very compelling. It's not quite, it's not nearly as radical as the declarative CSS modules. I think this looks familiar to folks who are familiar with HTML. This seems like a pretty good, outcome. So yeah, I'm curious what folks think. But yeah, this is kind of the proposal there. And so yeah, here's another example. Like, if you wanted to, later on add this to the global document, you could put a link rel tag and reference the sheet there too. So I think these two together, like, they're kind of two separate concepts, but when you put them together, you get this really nice flexibility for sharing styles. Yes.
Is there a specific reason why you'd want to scope it to an ID as opposed to just have it globally available in styles?
It's a good question. I think, yeah, I mean, like, just to have hey, give me all the styles inheriting through.
Yeah, like you already are specifying what sheet you want through sheet equals sheet one. So I'm asking, like, what does the href equals this specific style?
So essentially what that does is that breaks the it essentially the href is going to import the styles from that. Without that, the shadow DOM is going to block those styles. So the way shadow DOM works is if you don't have that href, those styles won't be imported. Like, you need to tell it where the styles are coming from.
Well, my point is, like, if you have multiple style blocks, so do you want to, maybe you want like some from one, some from the other. I guess you would have it in multiple places, but like you could just like have like href equal like some special thing like self or.
Yeah, yeah, I thought about this too, that you could have some kind of keywords to say, all, or, a star or something, or potentially like you could have a list of tags there that, a list of these references too, potentially. So yeah, it's a good idea. And so I did some rough performance numbers. I know this is kind of, risky, but I do have a prototype in a private branch of this. And it's a little risky to share, but, I am pretty impressed with this. I created a synthetic page with just 2,000 shadow DOM nodes, all, each one doing a link rel versus this LRLR, and it was quite a bit faster. I was kind of impressed. I don't think in practice you're going to get this drastic reduction in LCP. But I do think it shows that, hey, this does actually have some decent performance numbers. And so there was also, a slight reduction in memory too, just that it doesn't need to touch that file. It can just copy the styles right over. And so, I think, at the end of the day, I think, is there a world where both of these exist? I do think yes. They have some common behaviors, but there are also some differences there too. The @sheet and LRLR, or @sheet in particular, gives you improved bundling. Declarative CSS modules really just plug that gap in the adopted style sheets attribute. And there are some differences too between them. The @sheet and LRLR will follow standard scoping in HTML. So, the shadow DOM can access certain things in its parent scope, but things in a shadow root won't leak out to the main documents. Whereas any kind of modules have global scope. So that means if you were to define a CSS module in a shadow root, that would actually be available globally. So there is actually a world where both of these make sense, and you could have quite a few options for developers to, or all three of these, I guess, make sense. So you'd have quite a few options for style sharing. So yeah, that was basically everything. And I also want to do a thank you too before we go to questions. I had a lot of help with this from folks at Google. Noam and Mason have been super helpful, and then Dan, Allison, Kevin, and Andy have all been really, really helpful in getting this to where it's at. And then Westbrook and the working groups have been really, really awesome. So yeah, that's all I had prepared. I don't know how we are on time, but does anyone have questions? Yes.
I have a question. So there was a case in server-side rendering web components where you discover you're kind of inside a component and you discover you're about to render a component that needs some style. And then later, so you need to emit the style while you're already inside a component.
Yes.
And then later at the global scope or somewhere outside, you discover you need to reuse it and now you can't name it. Have you come up with any solutions?
I have not. That is a good question to bring up of like, so you've already emitted a name and then but it's within a shadow root, so you can't access it. And then you would potentially need to duplicate it later. Is that
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the modules one, since they have global scope, that would avoid this if you keep track of the name.
Right.
So yeah, that's a case where CSS modules would be a good option.
Yeah, or we could fix IDs to be able to navigate into open roots.
Yes. Alex, go ahead.
Please ship it. And then please also add some way to get an adopted style sheet reference from an at sheet.
Yes. Oh, yes, that's a good idea.
We need better CSS/OM just in general.
Yeah.
But like having these things, having to try to dig these things out of rule sets or something is just going to be a huge mess
Messy.
without some queryability based on sheet name.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a great idea.
Has declarative CSS modules already shipped?
No, it didn't. So there was another piece of feedback that the working groups also, so they want to think about modules holistically, and so they wanted like WASM modules to be spec'd and JavaScript modules and all these other ones. And they said like, oh, you're the only one pushing the CSS ones. Like we need, more consensus on some of the other types of modules. So I think it's going to be a little bit of time before that one's ready to ship.
Okay.
Which group was that? Was that TC39?
It's been a while.
That was Whatwig.
Yeah, Whatwig, yeah.
Dominic?
Dominic.
Dominic, okay.
Seems like the Flash event style comp is some orthogonal to this. All web components is something you want to solve, right?
Yeah, I do. So that the instance where you duplicate them, I have like a local, kind of tangential to this. I have a local fix that maybe I could talk to you about that does fix the Flash one style content. If the style sheet's already ready, it just copies copies the style sheet contents, and that seems to fix it in my repro cases. But I know, I would love to talk to you about it just to see if there's any other things I'm missing there. Awesome. Well, yeah, I think we're at time. I think it was 4:50, maybe was the end. 4:55. So we do have 2 or 3 minutes left if anyone does have anything else. Otherwise, I can call it.
Should it?
All right. Awesome.